Hi, my name's Don, and I'm an old school kind of guy. I thought today I'd give you a little history lesson. Now, there's a reason why you might be interested in this. And what I'm trying to do is get you into the mindset of the old school days. It sometimes helps to understand why we do things, and I talk about that all the time. What it was like when we didn't have everything we have today. And then as you go through this, I would like you to be thinking about what it's going to be like 20 years from now, or 30, or 40, or 50. Within our hobby is what I'm talking about. So when I talk about my old school days, they start in the 1960s. No, I didn't start in the 1960s, I started in the 1950s. Only problem is I don't remember the 1950s. Now, there's a lot that went on before my memory, and I've talked about little pieces of it, and I might bring up some more of that. But the 1960s, let's see, what happened in the 1960s? Well, first off, we had the first man in space. That was cool. Hey, we also had Woodstock. Now, that was really cool. I was a little bit young, but I actually had an offer to go with somebody heading that way, and I thought, why go to New York for a concert? We have concerts all the time in the Midwest, which is where I lived. So I didn't go. Besides, my parents would have freaked out because, like I say, I was still a little bit young. 1960s. You know, people can talk about the internet all they want. ARPANET was the real beginning of it. That was the 1960s. You can go research that for yourself. Hey, you know what else came out in the 1960s? Sesame Street. Now, we had Captain Kangaroo and all that stuff too, but Sesame Street, now that was a new concept. It was kind of cool, you know what I mean? Civil rights was a huge thing in the 1960s. And we always think about it as being black rights and the blacks being militants. It wasn't about blacks. It was about civil rights. Sure, they had a big piece of it, and it was important to them, and their views were important to society. But you know, civil rights was more than that, and especially when you consider Vietnam. Oh my goodness. You know, it's nothing like soldiers today. They come back, and yeah, they're all messed up, but they at least get treated with respect in some ways. Vietnam was a very divisive war within America. You had draft dodgers heading to Canada and elsewhere. You had people protesting the war, and they would, and I was a soldier, they spit on us at the airport and whatnot. And it was not a good time. Vietnam was sit-ins and protests and anti-war marches, and it was a terrible time. Of course, on the other hand, we had the hippie era. Hippies, yeah, free love, free dope, you know, communes, sometimes in houses in the city, sometimes in campgrounds, sometimes in unofficial camping spots. The prototypical VW bus, van, whatever you want to call it, with psychedelic paint and flower power, and that was kind of a crazy area. You know, one of the things all the guys liked was 1960s saw the bringing on of the mini skirts. Yep, the guys liked that. And also, guys started wearing long hair. Now, there have been long-haired guys throughout the history of mankind. I get that. In America, it was very uncommon up until the 1960s, and you know, that was kind of a weird thing going on. So all of that is going on. Meanwhile, oh, have you ever watched Forrest Gump? You know, when he blots that yellow shirt on his face and off comes a smiley face that says, "Have a nice day"? Yeah, the yellow smiley face, it came about in the 1960s. I don't think Forrest Gump had much to do with it, but the movie's cool. In the 1960s, most of the aquariums had stainless steel frames. The old tanks, you know, do you have an old tank today? I have some old tanks sitting around here. 10, 20 years old, a couple of them. They look a lot like the modern tanks. In the 1960s, the old tanks, just even 10 years old, 15 for sure, they had slate bottoms. That's because tanks were heated from underneath with a Bunsen burner. You had to watch your tanks carefully with that. You had to know exactly what was going on. And you know, another way to heat a tank was to take a regular incandescent light bulb, you know, or a standard light bulb of any kind, and put it in a mason jar, and then lower the mason jar until, you know, it's this far from in the water, so you don't get water in the jar, and stick that in your tank, and that would create heat. Yeah, it worked. Of course, we also had stainless steel hoods with the incandescent light bulbs in them, and it would heat the water. In fact, sometimes when you touch that hood, especially right over the light, it almost felt like you were going to burn your fingers. There weren't too many saltwater people back then. Think about it. Stainless steel and salt just don't mix. Just doesn't mix. The corners on tanks, the bottoms and the corners tended to leak quite easily, so if you bought a used tank, if it had been sitting dry very long, you had to repair the corners. The silicone we use today is much better stuff. The variety of fish available was paltry compared to today, minimal. I mean, the variety of fish we have today is just astounding. I've fallen in love with endlers. Never even heard of them back then. Yes, they'd been discovered before then, but I never saw one. Nobody talked about them. They were relatively unknown. And Rift Lake cichlids, Africans. I never saw them, never heard of them. There were a few that had been discovered, but just a few. It was not a big deal in the aquarium world. And today, African Rift Lake cichlids, in the freshwater world anyway, seem to be the dominant grouping. So back then, if you wanted the cichlids, mostly people were talking about, well, there was the crebenza, now known as a pulvichromis, and there were South American cichlids. We had the rams, the microgeophagus today they're called, Ramirez and Alta Spinoza, I think. We had some Honduran, some Central American. Of course, the convict was out, and the world famous Oscar, and a few more like that. But the variety was very unusual, very small. Some of the fish we consider common today were very unusual back then. The fish being shipped from Asia normally came by ship. And oftentimes they used something like a 55-gallon drum. Put a lid on it, poke a couple holes, ship the fish, massive losses, but you still got some through. You know, even coming from South America, they were usually shipped by boat. Maybe not in 55-gallon drums, but there were other ways of doing it. But actually, 55-gallon drums were in use to ship fish in those days. Large aquariums, and by large aquariums, I'm talking 55-gallon and bigger, even 40-gallon. Almost never seen, at least not in my world. They were too expensive for the average American to buy. You had to be either a very serious hobbyist or have a lot of money. Sometimes both. Most of our information came out of books and magazines. Aquarium societies were a new concept. There were a few. They were in the biggest cities. There was no internet to go look things up. You had no YouTubes. It was books and magazines. And if you were blessed enough, aquarium societies that brought in speakers. Not in my neck of the woods. In the 1980s, we got around to that for me. Let's see. Well, that's about it for the 1960s. So let's talk about the 1970s a little bit. Life was progressing. The average income in America in 1970s was about $8,500. At least in 1970, it went up through the next 10 years. $8,500 a year, and hey, let's go back to the 1960s for a minute. You know what the minimum wage was in 1960? $1.25 an hour. You want to try and live on that today? The average house in 1970 probably cost about $25,000. Much less in the 1960s. In the 1970s, the average middle-class house, sometimes $20,000, sometimes $25,000, maybe $30,000, in that range. You could buy a new car for $3,200. And I'm not talking about a compact import. I'm talking about a nice American-made, Detroit-made car for $3,200. Now, they had some that were more. And in comparison, when I was living in Hawaii in 1975, the wife and I bought a Honda. This is when they made one model. It was called a Honda. And we paid $2,500 for a brand new 1975 Honda car. And we bought every option they offered. Let's see, that included the AM radio. That's it. That was the only option. There was no automatic transmission. There were no interval wipers. There was no air conditioning. There was no power windows. These weren't even options. But we got a brand new car for $2,500 in 1975. Go figure. Drove it for 4 years until it was in an accident. And, you know, so be it. In 1970, to start the 70s, gas was 35 cents a gallon. As I recall, it was about 85 cents at the end of that. We went through the first gas crisis. The second one, we had gas lines. Sometimes you had to wait 2 blocks to move up and get gas. They often limited the amount of fuel you could get. Some states went with odds and evens. Your license plate, if it was even, you could get it on this day. If it was odd, you get it on that day. You know, even days and odd days. If you had 2 cars with even license plates, there were actually people that sold one and bought a car to get an odd license plate. And I know one guy that bought a car and he got another even from the motor vehicles, so he sold that one and bought another one. Finally got an odd, so he had an even and an odd. At the start of 1970, milk was 50 cents a gallon. By the end of the 1970s, it was over $1 a gallon. Just a little bit, but, you know, doubled in price in 10 years. Eggs, in the 1970s is when the economy really, prices jumped, salaries jumped. Those two are related, by the way. Study economics. And it got a little crazy, but eggs were around 60 cents a dozen in 1970. Stamps were at 4 cents a piece to mail a letter in 1970. I remember going to the first ever McDonald's in the state of Minnesota. The first year it came out, my family made a big trip there, and McDonald's commercials said, a full meal and you get change back for your dollar. And that was right. And by 1970, prices had gone up a little bit. For $1, you could get a double burger, fries, a salad, and an ice cream cone, and of course a small soda. For $1 at McDonald's. Well, I don't know if they had salads back then, but in a restaurant you could do that. McDonald's did have, in 1970, I believe it was 1970, the hamburger was 15 cents, the shake was 20 cents, you had 2 flavors, vanilla and chocolate. Maybe they had strawberry too, I don't know. You could get burger, fries, and a shake for 45 cents. Just a regular hamburger, a small fry, what we call a small fry today, and a small shake for 45 cents. That was a pretty good deal. Here's what I looked up. And I've looked up a lot of these facts. Six Flags, or amusement parks in general. Admission, $2.75. Now, a lot of them you had to buy a wristband to go on the rides, or you had to buy X number of tickets. But if you just wanted to go in and wander around and watch the kids, $2.75 in 1970. That's pretty cool. 1970, you want to go to a movie? Hey, there's a brand new John Wayne just came out. Tickets are 25 cents a piece. Yeah, popcorn was, I don't know, 10 cents? I don't remember. It was cheap. You know, it was good times, but like I say, in the 1970s, prices were going up and up and up. Talking about aquariums, by the 1970s, every new aquarium being sold was all glass. I had 10 gallons, 20 gallons, and 29 gallons. I had 30 tanks at my peak, and they were all 10 gallons, 20 gallons, or 39 gallons. Couldn't afford anything bigger. Those were my 29 gallons were my expensive tanks. There weren't really too many changes in the fish hobby in the 1970s, from the 1960s. Of course, there were new varieties of fish coming in all the time. It was a very exciting period for new discoveries. Tropical Fish Hobbyist magazine was, you know, you couldn't wait to get the new one because it would always have new species being discovered. It was really cool. The books were always 10 years behind, especially by the time they get to the library. If you could somehow get a list of books being published and go buy them direct from the publisher, that is great. But there was no B. Dalton or whatever sitting around. You couldn't just run down to the store and buy a brand new aquarium book. There wasn't much of a market for them, so for us, we had to wait until our library got them. You know, and think back, you know, saltwater was starting to become a hobby in the 1970s, especially towards the end, but it was still very new. It was considered very, very difficult. Only the elite who could keep their nose up very nicely. Hey, some of them were nice people. But it was a tough thing to do a saltwater aquarium. Freshwater, you know, think about this. Never heard of a mono shrimp, never heard of caridina, neocaridina. Freshwater shrimp were unheard of. Go look up Takayamano and see that his work didn't start until in the 80s, and he really didn't become published and his famous and his shrimp famous until the 90s. You know, back in the 60s and 70s, people set up a fish tank and they put in artificial plants to make it look natural, and then they put in a skull or a treasure chest or a broken down ship, or they put in a clam where the top goes up every time the bubbles build up. Planted tanks were almost unheard of. There weren't that many plants known in the hobby, and most of the people just didn't bother. Planted tanks were unnatural almost. And I'm not saying that some of us didn't have a few, but even for me, and I love the planted look, I only had a couple tanks with plants in them. You know, it just added expense that I didn't see any reason to spend. So we didn't have the Dutch scape or the, you know, all these different scaping methodologies you use today. You know, 6 different additives before you lay down your top substrate. You know, no, we didn't have all that. We didn't do all that. To us, peat moss was something you put in your filter in order to lower your pH. We didn't put it under the gravel in order to lower the pH and provide nutrients for the plants. We just put it in the filter, most of us. Filters back then, even in through the 70s, the most common filters, there were 2 of them. The little plastic corner or box filter. You put in a little filter floss, you put in some carbon, charcoal, and you drop it in with an airline, and then it worked nice. And you know, people today say, oh, you got to have all this biomedia so you have beneficial bacteria. Well, you know, one thing we knew back then, and we still know, and nobody ever talks about it, bacteria is everywhere. There's good bacteria, there's bad bacteria. You got bacteria growing on you right now. Everywhere you look in your fish tanks, there's bacteria. It's on the walls, it's in the filter, it's on the intake, it's on the plants, it's on the gravel, it's even growing on the fish and inside the fish. Bacteria is everywhere. So what's a filter for? A filter in those days was that little box. It was designed to suck in some of the dirt out of the water column, and the carbon helped clean up the ammonia. That's what we knew, and that's all we cared about. Some of us actually understood bacteria, but a lot of people did not. And it's just the way it was. The other really common filter back then was under gravel. There were people using under gravel. I laugh when I hear people today say, oh, but you can only use under gravel for a year and then you have to take it up and clean out underneath. Okay. I won't tell anybody that I ran tanks for 3, 4, 5 years with an under gravel filter and never tore them down and cleaned them up. I'm not going to tell anybody that. I'm not going to tell anybody that they were perfectly healthy. I'm not going to tell anybody that my fish were breeding like crazy in those tanks. I'm also not going to tell anybody that I had a whole bunch of tubifex worms, and because I love cory cats, I dumped tubifex, live tubifex into my tanks, and the tubifex would literally propagate throughout the substrate, and I didn't have to feed the cory cats hardly ever. Now, Tubifex does make them pretty fat. I'm not sure that's a good approach, but it's one I used. Anyway, I'm not going to tell anybody that I didn't tear down my under gravel filters. You know, yes, I knew about HOBs. I couldn't afford one. Yes, I knew about canisters. I could not afford one. And they didn't have self-priming back then anyway. Those things were beyond my price range. And no, I didn't know about sumps and so forth and so on. If I had known about sumps, I still wouldn't have bothered. I'm not a fan of sumps. I understand how great they are. Tremendous advantages to a sump. Not really something I need. But, you know, if you like a sump, more power to you. There's a lot of reasons to use one, and depends on your setup. They can be the best option for you. Consider it. And, you know, I'm not sure what else to say. It was a time when things were changing. The 1960s and 1970s saw a lot of advances. And every time a new fish was discovered, that was an exciting thing. These days, I think most people, they go to their local fish store and they see the most common fish. Why? Because that's what people want to buy. Oh, I heard of that one, I'm going to buy it. Well, I don't know anything about that one, I'm not going to buy it. Except for the extreme hobbyists, that's the way it is. So your local fish store is not going to have the newest, latest, and greatest. Didn't back then, don't today. It's up to the serious hobbyists to do their own research, to find them, to seek them out. Or in the words of a very famous 1960s and 70s TV show, you know, go where no one has gone before. Have fun.